There are no tax increases in this bill. In fact, it provides for tax cuts for the middle class. But they have to be paid for. George Bush the first and Dick Gephardt, the leader of this House, came together and said, ladies and gentlemen, we have to have fiscal responsibility, and we're going to do it. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to have pay-go. We're going to pay for what we buy. George Bush signed that. And guess what? The Republican side of the aisle excoriated the President of the United States, George Bush, for entering into an agreement that ultimately would bring us surpluses. Now, I've also listened to these debates and seen some very earnest, very intelligent, very articulate young men. Mr. Ryan is the third in a series of those earnest, intelligent, energetic, articulate young men who talk about their vision for America, talk about where they want to take America. Mr. Ryan puts up the children. Now, unlike Mr. Ryan, who I think has children, I've got grandchildren, and as some people know, I have a great-granddaughter. And I'm very concerned about all of those children whose taxes you have raised almost every year you've been in charge that I've been here, starting in 1981. And you raise their taxes by not paying for what you buy. You talk about cutting spending, I tell my friend.
Mr. Chairman, isn't the Speaker supposed to address the chair, not specific members?
Chair, may ask members to address the chair rather than individual members.
Mr. Chair, I would like to tell my friend that there's more ways to skin a cat than one. I tell the chair that I've heard the argument of these earnest young men who have all stood on this floor. David Stockman at the age of 34 telling the country as director of OMB how we were going to balance the budget. How Ronald Reagan said we're going to balance the budget. Ronald Reagan ran over $1 trillion in deficits over his 8 years. Over $1 trillion in deficits. There is one person in America who can stop spending in its tracks. Only one. And that's the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan ran $1 trillion in deficit, actually $1.4 trillion. George Bush in the first just 4 years ran $1 trillion in deficits. And this president, in the 6 years he's been president, has run over $1.6 trillion in deficits. $4.1 trillion of deficits during the Reagan administration, the Bush 1 administration, and the Bush 2 administration. Now, I tell the Speaker that my friend does not seem to be paying attention to these dramatic figures. But the ladies and gentlemen of this House, I hope are. And I hope all of our constituents are listening as well, because the rhetoric on this floor is cheap. But the performance is not. And during those 18 years of Republican leadership of this country, we ran $4.2 trillion in deficits. During the 8 years that Bill Clinton was president, we had a $62.9 billion surplus. The only president in the lifetime, I tell the Speaker, of my young friend from Wisconsin, that has been accomplished. Notwithstanding Mr. Stockman or Mr. Kasich or Mr. Nussel, who all said they wanted to balance the budget, and none of them did it. Kasich, I said Mr. Kasich, Mr. Nussel, and Mr. Stockman. None of them did it. Now, we adopted a program in 1993. And I heard the same rhetoric, I tell my friends on this side of the aisle, that I'm hearing today. The same rhetoric. And Dick Armey not only was the majority leader of the Republican House, but he was also, he wasn't the Republican House then, but he was also an economist. And an economist still. And Mr. Armey told the President of the United States, if we adopt this program, we're going to have deep debt, high unemployment, and annual deficits. That was the representation I tell my friends on this floor. Those representations were all wrong. That's why we listen to debate on this floor today, and we see a balanced budget, responsible budget that invests in our future. And I tell Mr. Speaker, if I were speaking directly to him, I'd tell my young friend, I've heard about these cuts that you talk about. For a quarter of a century, I've heard about these cuts. Why is it that you spent more money as a party with the president, with control of the Senate, control of the House, by a factor of 2? Twice as much spending rise under the Bush administration than under the Clinton administration. Why is that? Why do you come here and crow about cutting spending when you doubled the rate of growth, when you controlled everything? That's what the American public need to judge. Now, I had some prepared comments here, and I apologize to my good friend who spent so much time doing this. But, ladies and gentlemen, Lewis Carroll is not writing this budget. Alice is not going to have to live under this budget. My children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchild, and more importantly, my country are going to have to live under this budget. We didn't adopt a budget last year. We didn't adopt appropriation bills last year. We didn't do any of the fiscal business that we should have done last year. Why? Because your party could not agree with one another. So you had no fiscal program. Your fiscal program was spending more money. I hope that this House, for the first time in 6 years, adopts a responsible budget that will move us towards balance. It won't get there overnight. And when I say that, it is not empty rhetoric, because when we in 1993 passed the program, we took this country for 4 straight years out of deficit. Now, I know you will say, well, we Republicans took over in 1995. And my response to that, of course, is you didn't have the presidency. When you had it all, why couldn't you do it? When you had the presidency, when you had the Senate, when you had the House, tell me why you couldn't do it. I'll tell you why. Because it was the President of the United States who said, this is the way we're going to do it, or I'm going to veto it. This President can veto it, and we won't be able to override his veto. I understand that. He's in charge. That's why we have these deficits, because he has not vetoed one spending bill. He vetoed one bill, embryonic stem cell research. Not one spending bill. Every nickel that's been spent in this country has been spent under the signature of George Bush, the President of the United States. Every nickel. So I ask my friends, vote for a responsible budget. Move us as we did during the 90s, 4 years out of debt, 4 years into surplus, the first time that had happened, and left you folks that took over with a $5.6 trillion surplus that you have squandered into a $3 trillion deficit. And yes, 9/11 had an impact on that. And your tax cut, we had a very shallow recovery. You know that. Every economist says that. And a relatively shallow downturn in the economy. This budget, offered by Mr. Spratt, is a responsible budget that provides for tax cuts for the middle class, provides for investment in education and competitiveness of our country, provides for investment in our veterans, provides for investment in defense, using the same number that the President gave us so that we could keep America strong. Mr. Spratt, I thank you. I thank the members of your committee for having the courage and the wisdom and the fiscal soundness to come forth with this budget. It is worthy of support of every member of this Congress, and I urge this House to adopt this budget this day. And I yield back.